I grew up here in Chestertown, and my father was an avid outdoorsman, and so I spent my childhood growing up going out crabbing in the summertime. And my mother's side of the family goes back 6 generations in Kent and Queen Anne's County, and so oysters are just part of the fabric of life here. And so I mean, from the time I was really small, my pop-pop would shuck oysters into my mouth like a baby bird, you know, and I'd just be standing there and he's feeding me raw oysters. And so they really were what I grew up knowing. I had worked for Sultana, at the time Sultana Projects, now Sultana Education Foundation, before I started at the Maritime Museum, and I was really passionately, you know, fascinated by social history and the social history of the Chesapeake, but social history of the Chesapeake and the environment are, you know, irrevocably intertwined. And working at the Maritime Museum and getting more well-versed in environmental science, I could see how tangled up the Chesapeake was with oysters in particular, that they were a foodways and a tradition and an economy that went all the way back to the beginning, the very first chapter, you know, the Paleo Indians, and then all the way up to today, but people were still so emotionally connected to oysters, you know, that you'd read the newspaper and there'd be watermen reacting to a new regulation, or there'd be sort of the, you know, Chesapeake Bay Foundation talking about putting in an oyster sanctuary or suggesting a moratorium. And I mean, people's emotions ran so high over something that's not cute, that doesn't have a face, you know, that doesn't even have arms and legs. You know, it's not a great hero, but somehow it's become this just fascinating story. And over, you know, the course of time at the Maritime Museum, I'd say within the last 5 years, I started to get really interested in the topic and wanting to read historical, you know, books, The Oyster Wars of the Chesapeake by John Wennerston, or more contemporary books like The Oyster Question by Christine Kiner, ones that really explore the impact that oysters have had on our economy and our sense of place. But there wasn't a lot that was talking about the future or even the contemporary oyster situation. A lot was focused on the 19th century and the oyster wars, and people love to talk about that stuff. They really are focused on that time period. But the Bay Journal was doing such wonderful, you know, stories on the aquaculture and people's futures being tied up in this industry, and whether it was going to provide this outlet for, you know, the declining oyster fishery, especially in Virginia, where oyster mortalities were so high because of disease. And there really wasn't anything about that. And I was also sort of perceiving a changing oyster culture as it relates to foodways. Like, you know, it was sustainable, and it was, people were interested in the terroir of oysters. And so I love that it was such a now story that's happening now and changing now. And actually, that was something that was hard about writing a book about them, because I didn't know when to stop. You know, if I knew when to start, but I didn't know how far I should chase that story moving forward. So that was challenging. But, you know, I started out writing a blog for the Maritime Museum, Beautiful Swimmers, and I was writing articles for the Chesapeake Log, the magazine, and I started taking on some freelance work with the Bay Journal, and I kind of saw my future writing trending that way. But History Press approached me about writing a book about crabs. And I felt like, well, you know, we'll let William Warner have his Pulitzer Prize. You know, I would really like to write a book on something else that hasn't been so, like, you know, beautifully defined. And I really felt like oysters were an opportunity to tell that historical story that I think is so fascinating, with that contemporary piece that makes it relevant now. It was just this little document that lived on my laptop, and I just worked on it. It was like this never-ending project that seemed just ceaseless and all-consuming. And then all of a sudden, there it was, and it was huge. I mean, there were so many pages. It was amazing. But I don't know. I've said to friends that it's the closest I've gotten to, you know, producing any major work, or even like a kid, you know, and it's obviously, you know, the childbirth, I would assume, would be much messier given the latter scenario. But in my own experience, I felt a deep sense of pride in what I'd done and accomplishment. And, you know, it might be ugly, but it's all mine. I mean, that's kind of how I ended up feeling at the end of the day. I definitely feel like I hit my stride somewhere around like the 5th chapter. But I think I started out with a fear of losing the lyrical nature of my writing and just telling the story. And I realized as I progressed that those two could happen at the same time, and that I should just let the story come. I think I enjoyed the research a lot more than I thought that I would. I enjoyed the historical research a lot. I actually avoided a lot of I avoided the deeply historical chapters, and I sort of put them to the end because I was procrastinating. But the reality was I actually really, really enjoyed it, to the extent that, like you're saying, I found myself falling down all these rabbit holes that I had to pull myself back out of after it was on the page and say, this is not germane, or how many times do I actually say oyster on this page? What is actually related? You know, do I really need to tell the whole story of indentured servitude in the Chesapeake? Probably not, you know, but if anything, I feel like it cemented my love of the Chesapeake Bay, and I loved interviewing people and sitting down with them and having them share what they loved with me. I mean, the people that I talk to are passionate about what they do, and they've made big differences in their field with the work that they've done. And you know, just sitting down with them over a beer or a meal and having them just kind of go. I mean, there were some wonderful passages that I wasn't able to include, but I feel like overall they helped guide the book itself. And I think that was the other thing that I don't know that I could have anticipated, was how shaped and impacted the book would be by the voices of the people that contributed.